All right, welcome back. This is part two of the series on the historical Muhammad. We're going to be answering the question whether or not the Prophet's wars were defensive or not. I argue that they were, and I'm using the work of historical critical scholarship. Specifically, I'm looking at Professor Sean Anthony's book, Muhammad and the Empires of Faith, in order to bolster my argument. Okay, so in the first part of this video, we looked at the introduction of Professor Anthony's book. We're going to skip to chapter 3, where he's talking about the beginnings of the corpus, that is, the beginnings of the sīra, maghazi literature, and what the problems are that are associated with that literature. Really, the key point here is that obviously there's certain historical, social factors, political factors that we have to keep in mind that have influenced how this literature came about, and we should be cautious of it based on that. So I'm on page 89, and he says here, quote, "Firstly, we see the role of the wealthy, courtly elite and politically enfranchised scholars in overseeing and providing the impulse for the compilation of the Prophet's biography, for the sake of its broader dissemination." So we see that it's people that are associated with the court, and this is an imperial court, right? This is an imperial power. So by this time, we're talking, it started with the Umayyads, and then it's going to go to the Abbasids, and these were expansionist, imperialist powers, all right? So that's going to have an influence as to how the biography is going to be conceptualized. Now, really why I wanted to focus on Professor Anthony's work is because he translated in this work and provided for us actually one of, which could possibly be one of the earliest source that we can use for the sīra, other than the Quran, of course, that we talked about, but from the sīra maghazi literature, there are these letters that have been written from which we can construct a sīra. And so this is from ʿUrwa ibn al-Zubayr, and these are letters that he wrote to the caliph that have been preserved. Now there's a debate about their authenticity, and this is a fiery debate, but Professor Sean Anthony seems to say, even though he does say that, so he writes, quote, "These letters became an accidental corpus of early materials for the biography of Muhammad, which would then go on to be absorbed into other sources that we are now familiar with. The letters," he writes, "were written for private consumption, not for public dissemination and instruction. In this way, they differ markedly, blah, blah, blah." Okay. And they are the only such traditions to survive in document form. Now, then he goes on to the debate about their authenticity. All right. Ultimately, though, he argues that we have reasons, sorry about my phone, to say that this source is likely reliable. And this is now we turn to chapter 4, which are the letters of ʿUrwa ibn al-Zubayr. So he writes at the beginning, "These are 9 letters attributed to ʿUrwa ibn al-Zubayr, one of the famed 7 jurists, the fuqaha of Medina." So this is from the years 93 to 94 AH, sorry, from 93 or 94 AH to, I guess that's his death date, I apologize. So he died in either the 93rd or 94th year after Hijrah. So within 100 years is the point. And he writes that these may constitute the earliest extant written sources about the life of Muhammad. That is aside from the Quran, of course, but in the sīra maghazi literature. So he writes, "Ұрwa ibn al-Zubayr was the son of one of the more prominent companions of the prophets," etc. All right. If authentic, Urwa's correspondence with these caliphs certainly postdates 73 or AH, the year of his political reconciliation. Okay, so he's giving some contextualization that's important. Then on the next page, he talks about the authenticity debate. He does write that, quote, "My intent here is not to settle this debate over the letters' authenticity, but rather to make them more accessible to a broad readership." But he does say that a number of the letters' internal features argue in favor of their authenticity, or at least that most of them are. For one, they contain almost no miracle stories and very few embellishments. All right. All right, so that is what we are going to look at now. We're going to look at Urwa's letters. And the reason why we're going to look at Urwa's letters is because they give us a skeleton of the sīra that is earlier, and therefore could be that kind of kernel, the historical kernel that we're looking for, that could be more reliable than later sources. At minimum, we could say we can look at what embellishments did take place, and so we can rely on this source a little bit more easily than later sources like the sīra that is transmitted, Ibn Ishaq's sīra that's in the recension of Ibn Hisham. Okay. All right. So now I wanted to look at this. So he talks about the transmission, and now we go to the letters themselves. So the letters themselves start at page 110, and these are Professor Anthony's very professional translations that is helpful for us. So we notice that one of the first sections in letter 1 is about the early persecutions. I think this is important because it shows that the early Muslims were persecuted and they were responding to that persecution. Remember, my argument was that the Quran only justified warfare in response to equal retaliation for if you were harmed physically, someone tried to kill you, or for religious persecution. So here we see both of them at play, that the early Muslims are being subjected to this religious persecution. This is going to be critical when I, in the third part of this series, look at the list of wars and battles and the discourse that's on Wiki Islam, an Islamophobic website, where they try to imply that these wars are wars of offense, and I'm going to problematize that list. All right, so in letter 1, we see that the first section is about early persecutions. The letter writer Urwa writes, you have written me asking about the departure of the messenger of God from Mecca. That is when he was forced to flee. All right, and it basically says, quote, they, the Arab pagans, treated him, the prophets, harshly and despised what he said to them. Whoever would heed them, they instigated to harass him, so that most people kept away from him and abandoned him, except for those whom God preserved, and even they were few. Then things got worse, it says. Then their leaders conspired, quote, then their leaders conspired together to compel those who had followed him from their children, brethren, and clans to leave God's religion. That is, they were forcing them at the sword with threat of torture for them to leave God's religion. It was a persecution, fitna. This is critical to my argument, in which I argue that the Quran limits warfare to, basically it only allows warfare because there's a fitna, which is religious persecution. So we see here that it's clearly translated as persecution. What happened is that later Quranic exegetes glossed fitna to mean shirk or kufr. So then the phrase, fight them until there is no more fitna, which is religious persecution, is changed to fight them until there is no more shirk or kufr, which then advocates aggressive, perpetual holy warfare. So the correct way to understand it is, it's fight them until there is no more religious persecution. All right, and once the religious persecution stops, then you have to stop fighting them. So anyways, continuing with this letter, it was a persecution that sent shockwaves throughout the people of Islam who followed the messenger of God. Those who were lured away were lured away. I think this is, again, lured is probably from the same root as fitna, which this is really like seduced away. That is, they were put to the sword, and the reason why the Quran uses the word seduce for this and the sīra is because the idea, it's a theological idea, that you're so scared of losing this life that you lose out on the next life, which is a much bigger thing to lose out on. So you shouldn't be seduced by that. You shouldn't lose your faith just because of fear, at least in your heart. Even if on your tongue you have to say something, you shouldn't believe it in your heart if you're being forced to recant your religion. So, quote, it was a persecution that sent shockwaves throughout the people of Islam who followed the messenger of God. Those who were lured away, but God shielded those whom he willed. All right. When that befell the Muslims, the messenger of God commanded them to depart for the land of Abyssinia. So this is the first hijrah, actually. Muslims were forced to flee. 2 times to Abyssinia, and then the 3rd time to Mecca. This is a point that should really be emphasized. And we'll see when we go to the Wiki Islam sites and these Islamophobic sites, they want to ignore that completely. The persecution was so severe that the Muslims had to flee from Mecca, and that's how we know who the persecutors were, because the Muslims had to flee. And so in this earliest source that we have, we see that the fitna was so great that Muslims did in fact have to flee to Abyssinia. And what we find is, you know, I don't know if it's going to be in this source, but we'll see. That the pagans, they chased them to, so they didn't just say, okay, they're gone now, leave them alone. No, they sent a delegation to the king of Abyssinia and asked for the Muslims to be physically brought back against their will. So this idea that when Muslims fled to Medina, the persecution stopped is completely false. The aggression against the early Muslims continued, and that's why the Muslims were forced to defend themselves. All right. So continuing with this letter, quote, most of them went there when they found themselves beleaguered in Mecca. Okay, so they were persecuted. They were the weak ones. The prophet, feared what the trials of persecution, so I guess this should be they feared what the trials of persecution, al-fitan, again, same kind of word, same word, would do to them. But he himself remained and did not leave. That is the prophet. Okay. Such was the first persecution, al-fitna al-ula, that led to the departure of those companions of God's messenger who set out for Abyssinia out of fear, fleeing the trials and tremors it brought. All right. Then, when word reached the messenger of God's companions in Abyssinia that their fellow believers in Mecca were being let alone and that they were no longer being persecuted, some of those who had emigrated to the land of Abyssinia returned to Mecca, and they nearly even found security there. This is a debate. Looking at the sources that I've looked at, it seems like they mistakenly thought that the persecution had stopped in Mecca, and so they returned to their homelands. That shows that they did want to return, and the only thing preventing them from doing that was fear of persecution. All right. But then what happened is that the prophet started talking to the people of Medina. The Medinans began visiting the messenger of God in Mecca. And then, quote, when the Quraysh saw that, they spurred each other on to compel them, the Muslims, to abandon their faith and to deal harshly with them. That is, they're again forcing them to recant their religion. This is the fitna. Quote, they seized them and were eager to lure them away from their religion. And it was the final persecution, al-fitna al-akhira. A massive effort struck them, but these were the final persecutions, of which there were 2. A persecution that led to the departure of those who went to the land of Abyssinia when he commanded them to go, and to whom he grounded his permission to depart there, and another persecution once they returned and saw the number of Medinans who came to them. I believe there were 2 dispatches to Abyssinia, but I'd have to double check on that. All right. And it was during the final persecution, because the persecution had gotten so severe, and really this could be like this, it's the greater persecution. It was during this persecution that the messenger of God, quote, made his followers leave, and during which he himself left. And it was concerning this is a key point. It was concerning this that God revealed, quote, fight them until persecution is no more and religion is forgone. Okay. Now, this is verse 839. This has been a verse that was later militarized. So the word fitna was glossed to be shirk and kufr. And then the second part, religion is for God, was interpreted to mean that their, meaning the infidels' religion, the pagans' religion, is for Allah, that is, they become Muslim. This is a nonsensical interpretation, especially as we see that here in this source, we see that it's at this very early period, and that would defy this kind of progressive or evolutionary view of jihad. We see that actually this verse was revealed at the very beginning, and so the only interpretation that makes sense, and Ibn Ishaq also, there's a narration through him that interprets this verse this way: fight them until religious persecution is no more, and your religion, that is the Muslims' religion, is for God, that is, they are free to worship God and God alone. Okay, so the key point here is that from this earliest source, this early sīra that we have in the letters, we see that the war between the infidels, the pagans, began before and as the Prophet was migrating to Medina. It is not the case, as some Western scholars continue to say. I believe Professor Reuven Firestone has argued this, and many others, that and Islamophobes, and I'm not saying Reuven Firestone is one, not at all, but some Islamophobes like Wiki Islam and these kind of folks, they try to portray it that the Muslims were now free in Medina, and for no reason at all, or just because of poverty or some other like financial reasons, Muslims started to attack and aggress against the Quraysh, the pagans of Mecca. But this is not the case. The war had already commenced, and that is the reason why the Prophet fled to Medina. That is why hijrah is connected with jihad. It's hijrah wal jihad, right? These are simultaneously. The reason why they had to do the hijrah was because now a war had been declared and was occurring between a state of conflict, a state of war is now in place between the Quraysh and the early Muslims, the Prophet and his followers. So now the next section talks about the Prophet's hijrah with Abu Bakr. All right. And here we also know that this is where the Prophet is, the Quraysh didn't just say, okay, let him go. He wants to leave us and we'll be rid of him and that's good. No, they were actually actively trying to kill him, and they hatched a plot to kill him. And this is why the Prophet had to flee in secret. And so this is the hijrah that's narrated here. All right. All right, and this is interesting. This is now Professor Anthony's commentary. He writes, quote, "While much of the narrative in this letter on Muhammad's hijrah accords with later tradition, and indeed forms its basis, the claim that here, made in the letter, that Mecca's Quraysh were initially receptive to the public preaching of Muhammad's message until the arrival of certain wealthy Qurayshi interlopers from Taif, is unique to the Urwa tradition." So that's interesting that it's after some support from influential persons, that is when the Quraysh got concerned. All right. And it's possible that Urwa suppressed the names of other wealthy Meccans, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. And he notes that there's no mention of the satanic verses, which is interesting. All right. What else do we have? Now, moving on, we have letter 3, which is about the Battle of Badr. Now we see that all of that is mentioned here is, so instead of mentioning all of these different raids and stuff, what we do have is that he writes, quote, "You wrote me concerning Abu Sufyan and his expedition to ask me about how it transpired. What happened was that Abu Sufyan was on a return journey from Syria with riders from the clans of Quraysh, about 70 in all. They had been trading in Syria and were heading back together with wealth and traded goods." All right, so they mentioned this to the messenger of God and his companions, for there had been a battle, but there had been a battle between them before that. That is to say, there was already a conflict going on. Several warriors had been killed. All right, and this is a raiding party. We're going to talk about this in the next video when I take a look at Wiki Islam's entry. And during that battle, several captives were taken from the Quraysh. Okay. It was this event that provoked the war between the messenger of God and Quraysh. So this is, how do we reconcile this? We reconcile this is when it went from a state of what you can call Cold War to hot war. This is when the actual fighting commenced. Okay, there was already a state, there was the peace had already been broken, the conflict was on, but there was a delay before actual acts of war took place. So this is when those acts of war took place. And it was the first conflict in which inflicted casualties on one another. And that all happened before the trading expedition of Abu Sufyan and his cohort to Syria. So this is, again, very important to keep in mind. All right. So yes, the Prophet was trying to attack their caravan, but this is because a state of conflict already existed, and this is a legitimate act of warfare. Why do you think in World War I and World War II they intercepted? They had submarines and this kind of thing. So this is part of war. All right. So now we're going to look at, so the Badr, what's interesting is the Battle of Badr is mentioned here. And the victory there. They met each other in battle, the Meccans and the Prophet, and God granted his messenger victory. He disgraced the leaders of the infidels and granted the believers' hearts the vengeance they craved, so they were victorious. And then so that's letter 3. Letter 4 talks about, I think, yeah. This is al-Hudaybiyah, so the treaty that was signed. And we note from here that the treaty that was signed between Muslims and non-Muslims was disadvantageous. And, you know, even using the word Muslim might be a little bit anachronistic, but the early believers and the Quraysh, here we see that the Muslims had the Prophet signed a treaty that was actually disadvantageous to him and the believers. So that is how much peace was prioritized, or one could say how, you know, they might have been weak at that time. All right. Then the letter 5. So we have this peace treaty that's struck. So what do the sources tell us? They tell us that there was a raid before the Battle of Badr, then the Battle of Badr, then a treaty that was signed, and then we have the treaty is broken by the Quraysh, and this results in the conquest of Mecca. And this is in letter 5. Quote, at the time, the armistice and the pact made at al-Hudaybiyah was in effect between the Prophet and Quraysh for the agreed upon period. The Bakr clan was also party to the armistice with Quraysh, but a group of the Ka'b clan and another from the Bakr clan battled. One of the stipulations of the armistice drawn up between the Messenger of God and the Quraysh was, quote, no traps laid and no swords drawn, but Quraysh aided the Bakr with weapons. The Ka'b clan made accusations against Quraysh, and on the basis of this, the Messenger of God led an expedition against the Meccans. So it seems like the early believers were drawn into this due to a mutual protection pact that was triggered when the Quraysh violated the peace treaty. And so once they, quote, once they pledged them their allegiance, he sent them ahead of the Quraysh, calling on them to embrace Islam. And then we see that the Prophet said that whoever enters the home of Abu Sufyan is safe, and whoever enters the home of al-Hakim is safe, and whoever locks his door and withholds his hand, he is safe. So we see that the Prophet, even though he's coming to, and Juan Cole makes a good point, Professor Juan Cole, and I apologize, I've said Juan Cole a lot in the past, I don't know why, but Professor Juan Cole makes a good point that the later sources approach it as a conquest of Mecca, that is like a great military thing, but the Quran seems to indicate it in a different direction, that it wasn't this militarist conquest, but more of a peaceful affair, that his enemies surrendered, and the Prophet gave amnesty to them. And this seems to be corresponding to what's in this letter. All right, because look, we have now, this is in that letter, letter 5, we're talking about the quote-unquote conquest of Mecca, and the writer says, quote, I was told that the Prophet told Khalid and al-Zubayr when he sent them, quote, attack no one unless they attack you, unquote. This is the same ethic that I talked about before, that permission is granted to fight whoever fights you, but do not aggress, right? So this is the same ethic that's all the way at the end when Muslims are being victorious. The Prophet could have taken vengeance on his people, but he didn't. Instead, again, the same ethic is there. Attack no one unless they attack you. And this is in our earliest source here. When Khalid came upon the Bakr clan and the mixed clans, he fought them and he routed them. This was the only killing that transpired in Mecca. There was no fighting in the upper part of Mecca in the direction of al-Zubayr. And after the Prophet came and the people rose to pledge him their allegiance, etc., etc. Okay. Now, important, after the victory, the Prophet stayed in Mecca for half a month. Not a moment longer was it before Hawazin and Thaqif came and made camp at Hunain, which is a valley, etc. That day, they were on their way, hoping to face the Prophet in battle. They had joined forces before that when they had heard that the messenger of God's sortie from Medina, for they thought that he was heading for them when he left Medina. Once they heard that he had encamped at Mecca, Hawazin turned to head for the Prophet, and they had taken their possessions, their women and their children along with them, with the intent to do battle with the Prophet. So that is how the next battles continued. It was, again, aggression upon the Muslims. So it is in self-defense. And those forces, once they were routed, that is when they retreated to Ta'if. And then we see that the source says, for half a month, the messenger of God and his companions waged war against them because Thaqif fought from behind the fort and would not fight in open battle. All of those who lived in their environs became Muslim and sent their delegations to the messenger of God. All right. So we see that these are the battles that are mentioned in this early source. And we see that all of them are defensive in nature. So what is not mentioned in these sources, and I'm looking at the rest of the letters, is any further raids, any raids that talk about converting tribes to Islam and giving them, the choice of Islam or the sword. None of this is mentioned. So looking at this source, I think what we can say is that if this is the skeleton survey that we can take, it corresponds to the view that in the Quranic conception, these battles could be perceived as defensive in nature, that they were due to religious persecution or equal retaliation, one of the two, or both of them actually. And I think the Quranic ethic corresponds to the prophetic biography if we take this early source and we consider many of the other battles as being embellishments, later embellishments. Now, going to chapter 6, I think of Sean Anthony's book, I think we can reinforce this view that it is this later rhetoric of empire that then will cause these embellishments to enter into the narrative. So he writes, quote, if one accepts that the court, the Imperial Court, shaped the sīra Maghazi literature, it is essential to ask how the court impulse also influenced the content of the Maghazi traditions as well. In other words, how did the ideologies undergirding the conquest of the early Islamic polity and the expansion of the hegemony of its elites shape and impact the narratives of the sīra Maghazi? I contend that the rhetoric of empire in late antiquity profoundly shaped this corpus in hitherto underappreciated ways. The early purveyors of the sīra Maghazi tradition adopted a pre-existing language of political legitimacy rooted in the traditions of the Byzantine or Sassanid empires on the one hand, while on the other, they also sought to forge a new imperial discourse. I mean, this is exactly what I'm arguing with when it comes to jihad. So this is being read back into the sources. And then he writes on the next page, page 177, the Hadith and Sīra Maghazi literature do speak frequently and freely of the dominion of the Prophet and his community, that is a kingship, and do so in overwhelmingly positive terms. Indeed, that this literature came to propound a distinctly triumphalist view of the emergence of the early Islamic community of believers should not be surprising. It matches up, in my opinion, with, quote, and this is what Sean Anthony writes here, the expansionist policy of the burgeoning polity, that is the Umayyads and the Abbasids. Hence, quote, the political ideology that permeates the Sīra Maghazi literature is most evident when it provides answers to the following question. How does the prophecy of Muhammad undergird the claims of the early Islamic polity to hegemonic rule? Okay. So basically, what's happening is that this Sīra literature is being theologized in such a way as to justify imperial conquest and a sense of manifest destiny. In fact, Sean Anthony uses this word manifest destiny on page 178. Ibn Ishaq provides us with one of the clearest visions of the Prophet's mulk, as that is his dominion, as signaling a manifest destiny conferred upon the Prophet's community. All right. I think we've driven our point home. Now, even it should be noted that, quote, victories over Jewish opponents mentioned in the Quran provide a foretaste of this promise. And I would argue, and this is something that needs more, we need to talk about this more, that a lot of the literature about the conflicts between Muslims and Jews is written with this triumphalist and supersessionist idea in mind. So we shouldn't just take it uncritically. There is a theological reason for having these sorts of narratives, which, by the way, are not mentioned in this early sīra source that we have just looked at. Now, key point here. Indeed, and I'm just quoting now from the bottom of page 180 going into 181. Indeed, one of the major themes of the Sīra Maghazi literature is to make explicit the triumphalist claims of Quraysh to political hegemony rooted in Qur'anic discourse and narratives of the sacred prophetic recent past. The triumphalist adoption of this Qur'anic theme even made its impact on early Syriac disputational literature in the 8th century. All right. So this is being read into these early sources. All right, do I want to quote anything else? Let's see. In fact, we see that some of these early sources, these legends, portray, quote, Heraclius as having some foreknowledge of the early Islamic conquests. This legend, in fact, appears in an extraordinarily broad range of non-Muslim sources. So we see that the early Muslims are trying to connect their conquests with the prophets. And so we should be very suspicious about, how they theologize these conflicts and try to pull in the war. And Juan Cole writes a lot about this, about how the early sources want to portray it that the prophet himself initiated the battles against the Byzantines. All right. And then Professor Anthony writes about Muhammad's letter to Heraclius. I mean, I think we can clearly take this as legendary. All right. And I think we are nearing the end. Quote, let's just go to the very end, page 202. Quote, Az-Zuhri's legend of Heraclius' vision must certainly be tied to the Umayyads' effort to root their political legitimacy in the mandate of Muhammad's prophetic mission. Az-Zuhri successfully weaves a tale of God's abandonment of one empire for another that simultaneously shores up Arab Islamic triumphalism. His account is pleasing, therefore, not just to his Umayyad patrons, but also to the conquest elite who embraced the expansionist ambitions of the early Islamic polity more broadly. The story thus creates what one might deem a Muslim version of the doctrine of translatio imperii, transfer to rule, intended to legitimize the transfer of the Romans' imperial capital to Constantinople as the new or second Rome. Okay, so now we are going to chapter 7. Key section here where Professor Anthony points out that many hadith scholars were initially themselves storytellers, and a narrative related by such a storyteller was not necessarily qualitatively different from a hadith or khabar at this point in time, especially at such an early stage when categories such as these were necessarily still not fully crystallized. All right. Quote, page 218, the influence of biblical archetypes on the Sīra Maghazi narratives has been demonstrated by Arabists and historians of early Islam in recent years. Okay, we're nearing the end. Now, at the very end on pages 228 to 229, or actually more than that, Professor Anthony questions the Iqra narrative, which is one of the foundational narratives of Islamic history, when the first a revelation was supposedly came down on to the prophet. Now he questions the historical this historical narrative. So that's why I think that if he's going to question that, then I think we should. It's equally fair of us to question the battle narratives. We can't say that there's any reason to take those historical narratives as factual, and yet we're being so cautiously skeptical about other foundational elements of the prophetic life story. That just doesn't make sense to me. All right. And then he does point out that there are alternative accounts of that first revelation story. All right. Finally, we're just going to conclude with the epilogue, the future of the historical Muhammad. He writes, can the modern historian really work with the Sīra Maghazi literature? Or is this corpus hopelessly mired in legend? And then he writes, in the introduction, I refer to the Sīra Maghazi literature as a second-order source for the life of Muhammad and his world, and hence of lesser reliability as a source of historical evidence than our first-order sources, that is the Quran, material and documentary evidence from the 6th to 7th centuries, and non-Muslim sources from the 7th century. Okay, so I agree with this. I definitely agree with that the Quran is our first source, and that is why when I'm approaching this issue of battles and wars of the prophets, I say, let's look at the Quran first. Let's just ask a very commonsensical question. If the Prophet was really waging wars of offense and aggression, why didn't the Quran simply just say to do that? It could simply have drawn on biblical motifs and narratives and said that, look, just like Moses and Joshua were told to go and conquer the land of the Holy Land and, cleanse the land of the infidels and all this kind of stuff. Why didn't the Quran just embrace this and simply say it? Why is the Quran bending over backwards to portray its portray the Prophet's wars as if they are the ones defending against aggression? Why do all of this unless the Quran itself accepts the view that aggression is never tolerated, which it explicitly says in multiple places? So that's why I think we should first look at the first order source, the Quran. Then when we approach the second source, which is the Sīra Maghazi literature, I think we should definitely be skeptical of the embellishments that came later. And based on these letters, we can say that we can accept this skeletal survey of the skeleton of the Sīra and say that this corresponds to and is compatible with what we learn from reading the Qur'anic view of war and peace, and that anything that contradicts with that is a later embellishment. This is a reasonable conclusion to reach. All right, especially when we know, as Professor Anthony said at the near the end of his book, that these imperial powers were trying to justify their conquests, and this is why they wanted this Sīra Maghazi literature to be formulated. So we should be suspicious. All right. So, quote, however, I also propose that despite it being a second-order source, historians can indeed work with the Sīra Maghazi literature, not just as a source for tracing how Muslim communities constructed a cultural memory of Muhammad, but also as a source for understanding the life of Muhammad himself as a mere person of history, as opposed to the Muhammad of faith. Scholars must always approach this material with a, quote, skeptical caution rather than optimistic trust, unquote. Therefore, I say that we should approach any long lists of battles and raids with, quote, skeptical caution rather than optimistic trust. I agree, Professor Anthony. All right. And he does say that when we look at what evidence we have, the first order sources, at least, which I think is the Quran, and the first three sources, the other two sources being those non or secular sources, we can get what one might call, quote, a low resolution view of the historical Muhammad to help guide us in approaching the Sīra Maghazi literature. But then by cautiously looking at the Sīra Maghazi literature, we can get a slightly higher resolution view of Muhammad. Quote, even if, and now we're at the last 2 pages, so we're almost done. Quote, even if interpreting the Quran historically is a formidable task, the Quranic text fills out the outlines of a, quote, mere Muhammad that is much in accord with what one can infer from the earliest non-Muslim accounts of his life. As Fred Donner has masterfully shown, the Quran, it conveys a great deal to us about the fundamental beliefs espoused by Muhammad and his early community. And then he lists those that we can take for granted. I agree with almost all of them. The only one that I contest is the one where Fred Donner also writes this, and then Sean Anthony mirrors it, and he says, quote, the Prophet's militancy and the sacred struggle of his community in pursuit of God's path to expand their dominion and to establish justice. I disagree with this. If we look at the Quran and we take it seriously, we can see that aggression is never tolerated, and the only 2 times that you're allowed to wage a just war is if, number 1, you are attacked, and number 2, you are religiously persecuted and your community faces this existential threat. Then, that is, the 2 are qisas, that is equal retaliation, or fitna, religious persecution. These are the only 2 things that allow you to that give you just cause to wage war. So based on the Quran, we can accept this idea, and based on the skeleton of the sīra that we can get from this early sīra, we can accept that it does correspond to the Prophet's life story. All right, keeping on with this, if we wish to move on from such a low resolution view of the historical Muhammad to a higher resolution one, the Sīra Maghazi literature has an indispensable role to play. This literature conveys too much in the way of raw data for it to be either ignored or categorically rejected. Even if one decided to be so radical as to reject the historicity of all the narratives of this corpus, the data that it conveys about the geography of Arabia, both human and topographical, remains indispensable. But source minimalism is unwarranted. Larger questions about Muhammad and his historical context will only come into sharper focus as we scour this corpus. And the corpus is vast. Much of it is still unexplored in a sufficiently systematic way in Western scholarship. However, if the picture form is coherent and reliably so, historians will have scant basis, I believe, for rejecting the data provided by the Sīra Maghazi literature as baseless and unmoored in the historical realities of Muhammad's lifetime. So you can see that this is a very, and that's the end of the book. So you can see this is a very balanced view. And again, I think if we take this approach, we can understand the Prophet's battles, putting the Quran in conversation with this historical material, and it just reinforces our view that the Quran and the Prophet did not sanction wars of aggression. And this has obvious political ramifications, it has religious ramifications, and that's why I'm putting out such a video, even though it may be frowned upon in the academy to put out such public work. Thank you so much. And now in the next part, we will look at Wiki Islam and see what all the problems are with that source. Thank you very much.